Thanks for tuning in to this episode of History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, where we explore history's greatest sieges. If you know anybody that enjoys this genre of history, please share the podcast with them and give us a review. In the early 1880s, the British Empire was at its height, financially dominant, militarily unmatched, and politically entangled across the entire globe. Egypt, though nominally under Ottoman sovereignty, had long since become a strategic holding of European powers. Its control over the Suez Canal made it indispensable to Britain's global trade and imperial logistics. But Egypt itself was unstable, crippled by debt, governed by weak or self-serving leadership, and internally divided. South of Egypt, in the harsh and sparsely governed lands of Sudan, unrest began to harden into rebellion. What emerged in that desert was not a traditional uprising, but a religious and military movement led by a man claiming divine mandate. His followers believed him. His enemies underestimated him. The empire, distracted by bureaucracy and overreach, failed to act with urgency. That failure allowed a local force, poorly armed but unified in purpose, to confront and eventually overrun imperial troops that were meant to symbolize global supremacy. The consequences extended far beyond that particular battlefield. The events in Sudan reshaped British military policy and colonial doctrine for decades. They undermined the credibility of political leadership at home. They hardened racial and cultural ideologies within imperial planning, and in a direct line, they gave rise to one of Britain's most significant military figures, who would later play a decisive role in World War I, and whose approach to warfare would influence the handling of rebellions and colonial campaigns across Africa and Asia. This episode traces that turning point, not as a tale of exotic lands or imperial romance, but as a sober examination of how a single collapse in command, commitment, and comprehension helped unmask the limits of empire and shaped the modern legacy of Western intervention in the Muslim world. Let's now experience the Siege of Khartoum.
Welcome to History's Greatest Battles, Season 2, Episode 44, The Siege of Khartoum, from the 12th of March, 1884, to the 26th of January, 1885. Mahdist forces, roughly 60,000 men. Egyptian forces, roughly 8,000 regular soldiers and 3,000 Sudanese volunteers. Gordon's fall shattered what remained of Egyptian authority in Sudan. The region, once claimed in maps and ledgers, slipped into the hands of the Mahdist state. But in Britain, the loss reverberated beyond strategy. It struck the national psyche. A public accustomed to victory saw one of its most revered officers abandoned and butchered. The outcry wasn't fleeting. It hardened into a new imperial posture, less hesitant, more aggressive. From that point forward, British ambition in Africa intensified, not merely to reclaim lost territory, but to prove that the empire would never again tolerate humiliation at the hands of those it considered beneath its dominion.
In the 1870s, Egypt was Ottoman territory in name only. Real power sat with Ismail Pasha, the Khedive, a man who ruled like a king but with none of the restraint. Ismail's greed knew no limit. He emptied the treasury with reckless abandon until Egypt was drowning in debt. The British and French, alarmed and eager to protect their interests, muscled in. They sent in accountants with the authority of generals and took over the nation's purse strings. By 1880, numbers on paper weren't enough. Europe sent boots. British infantry made up the bulk, landing not as guests, but as enforcers of order. The sight of foreign officers giving orders in Cairo sparked fury. Egyptians rallied under Colonel Arabi, a military man with fire in his blood. The British crushed him, fast and hard. South of Egypt, in the brutal Sudanese desert, a new force emerged, this time driven not by politics, but by divine fire. A man named Muhammad Ahmed stood up and declared war on unbelievers. He called himself the Mahdi, the guided one, the Messiah. He wasn't asking for followers, he was claiming them. The prophecy of a Muslim savior wasn't new. Across centuries, men had risen claiming that title. Some mad, some brilliant, but all dangerous. Muhammad Ahmed was the latest and perhaps the most cunning. Whether he believed his own claim or not didn't matter. His followers did, and they were ready to kill for him. He began with a handful of fanatics in the dust, but every victory, every skirmish where his men stood and others broke, drew more to his banner. The British labeled them dervishes. The word barely captured the ferocity these men brought to battle. Traditionally, a dervish was a mystic, spinning, chanting, lost in his trance. But these warriors weren't dancing. They were cutting down trained troops without blinking. The British kept the name because what they saw in the field was death-defying, unflinching zeal. These men didn't hesitate. These men didn't retreat. They died moving forward. In 1881, the Mahdi struck. His fighters took El Obeid. It was more than a victory, it was a message. The uprising had become a war. Prime Minister Gladstone barely raised an eyebrow, until the Mahdi's men obliterated a full Egyptian column led by a British officer. That got London's attention. In 1883, General William Hicks marched 10,000 poorly trained troops into the heart of Sudan. At Kashgil, they vanished, ambushed, encircled, and annihilated. Hicks and his men were wiped from the map. Hicks had brought an arsenal, modern Krupp-filled guns, thousands of rifles. The Mahdi now owned them all. After Kashgil, the doubters fell silent. The Mahdi wasn't just a preacher anymore, he was a conqueror, and tribes flocked to him. Among those who answered the call were the Hadendoa, fierce hill warriors from eastern Sudan. They rallied behind Osman Digna. Digna wasn't beloved and he wasn't a polished officer, but he knew how to hit the enemy where it hurt, and he made sure his men got paid in plunder. Late in 1883, Digna's forces tore through two Egyptian armies near Saukin like paper. But it was on the 5th of February, 1884, that Digna sealed his reputation. Hicks' successor was Valentine Baker, a veteran of both the British and Ottoman services, a man with credentials, if not a bit of luck. Baker was leading 3,800 men to relieve the garrison at Tokar, a mission that would become a disaster. His troops were a chaotic mix: seasoned black soldiers from the south, former slaves turned warriors, alongside European officers and a mass of Egyptians who had no heart for the fight. At El Teb, 1,200 Hadendoa launched a sudden, ferocious attack. The British mockingly dubbed them Fuzzy Wuzzy for their greased hair, but behind the nickname was a reputation for raw, savage skill in close quarters. The Hadendoa charged with spears and clubs alone, no rifles. Still, the Egyptians broke almost instantly, fleeing in terror before a single blow landed. This retreat turned into chaos. The disciplined black troops tried to hold, and the Europeans stood their ground, but they were overwhelmed and they were butchered. When the dust settled, Baker had lost 2,400 men, clubbed to death. Thousands of rifles gone, 500,000 rounds of ammunition gone, and with them, 4 Krupp guns and 2 Gatlings, straight into Digna's hands. The British struck back hard, 2 punishing counterattacks that restored their honor, if only briefly. But while skirmishes lit up the Red Sea coast, the real contest, the storm that would define an era, was gathering in Khartoum. Gladstone, a cautious man, chose retreat over confrontation. He dispatched General Charles Gordon to Khartoum, not to fight, but to evacuate. Gordon wasn't Gladstone's kind of man. He was a lone wolf, brilliant, bold, impossible to manage. He'd made his name in China and earned the love of the British public. He knew Sudan. He'd ruled it once already. In late January of 1884, Gordon landed in Cairo with Colonel Stewart at his side. He wasn't just back in the game. He was at the heart of it. The mission was clear: get the Europeans out. But between Cairo and Khartoum, something shifted in Gordon. Withdrawal no longer sat right with him. Gordon saw the Mahdi not just as a threat, but as a fraud. an enemy of civilization and of God. And he made his choice. Khartoum would not fall on his watch. The crowd roared when he arrived in Khartoum. To Gordon, it felt like confirmation. This city wanted a defender. But it was a misread. The people thought he'd brought an army, and he hadn't. When he told them he'd brought only faith, not reinforcements, the cheers died fast. London had made it clear no army was coming. Still, Gordon fired off telegram after telegram, and the people of Britain listened. They rallied. Khartoum sat far from help, at the fork of the blue and white Nile, beautiful, remote, nearly unreachable. Gordon had no choice but to hold. Help, if it came, would take months. His force was thin. 8,000 Egyptian troops he barely trusted, and 3,000 Sudanese volunteers with grit, but with very little training. The city's geography offered one path in from the south. Gordon wasted no time. He ordered trenches cut deep and blockhouses raised beyond the walls. Mines were buried. Wire was stretched tight. Gordon mounted his best guns on steamers along the riverbanks, floating firepower to rake any attack from the flanks. In May of 1884, the wires went dead. The Mahdi had severed Khartoum from Cairo. His first demand for surrender arrived not long after. It was confident, bold, and full of divine threat. Gordon read the terms, convert or fall. He didn't hesitate. He rejected it, absolutely. Gordon struck back with a sortie, aimed at crushing the dervish patrols encircling him, but his Egyptian troops broke the moment the enemy charged. 400 killed, and not one single enemy felled. Gordon, out of furiosity, acted fast. He court-martialed and executed the company commanders without ceremony. Message received: fear him or die. The Mahdi handed the siege to his lieutenant, Abu Girgir, a man who wasted no time. He opened fire on Khartoum with the very Krupp guns taken from Hick's grave. The guns roared from a safe distance. Gordon's riverboats couldn't touch them. Shells rained down day and night. The Mahdi's forces controlled the river north and south. No food, no ammo. Nothing got in. In August, Gordon gambled. He sent Muhammad Ali, one of the few Egyptian officers he believed in, on a mission to break the ring. Ali hit hard. He scattered the dervishes from their lines with barely a scratch on his men. It was a rare, clean win. Encouraged, Gordon escalated. He launched 1,000 men to crush the enemy's main camp, and the strike worked until Ali chased too deep into the sands. The dervishes turned, ambush, massacre. Not a single man returned. Desperate for relief, Gordon put Colonel Stewart and 2 journalists on a steamer. Their mission was to break the lines, reach Cairo, and cry for help. They slipped the siege with ease, but downstream the river betrayed them. The boat ran aground. They had trusted the wrong man, a local they believed was loyal, yet he handed them over. They were executed without ceremony, their heads taken from their bodies. Still, relief was coming. Too slow, but coming. Back in London, word of the siege hit hard. Parliament argued. They bickered, delayed, while Gordon held the line alone. The people wouldn't let it go. The Queen herself waited. By September, Gladstone finally gave in. A relief expedition was ordered. But the road to Khartoum was a nightmare, worse than any map could show. The Nile offered a path, but it was choked with cataracts, whitewater death traps that shredded supply lines. General Sir Garnet Wolseley, a cold and a meticulous man, took command. He was late out of the gate and buried in logistics. Boats were built from scratch. Canadian voyagers were brought in. Camels were trained. Every trick in the imperial playbook was thrown at the river and the desert beyond. By January of 1885, they'd done the impossible. The expedition was moving. It was moving slowly, but surely. They battled heat, terrain, and dervish ambushes at Abu Klea and Abu Kru. They were close, just days away. But Sir Charles Wilson, leading the final push, halted for 3 days to regroup and care for the wounded. And then the boats arrived. Wilson loaded his men and steamed south. 4 long days to Khartoum, but it was too late. The Mahdi had taken the city 2 days prior. When word reached the Mahdi that British relief was nearing, he made his move. No more waiting. He hadn't wanted to storm the city, not yet, but his commanders pressed him. They wanted Gordon broken. The Mahdi feared a trap, take Khartoum and be besieged in turn, but he wouldn't let Gordon's cross outlast his crescent. One final offer: surrender. Gordon refused. At dawn on the 26th of January, the Mahdi unleashed his men. The Mahdi gave a rare order: take Gordon alive. He respected the man's unshakable faith, even as an enemy. Gordon called every male, from boys to old men, to the walls, but they were starved, broken, hollow-eyed. Most couldn't fight or even stand. Legend says Gordon stood alone at the palace stairs, unarmed, defiant, and then run through by a spear and beheaded on the spot. But those who saw it say otherwise. Gordon didn't die quietly. He fought to the end, blade in hand, fury in his eyes, as if something greater had taken hold of him. For 317 days, General Gordon stood against the tide, not with reinforcements, not with promises, but with his own will alone. The city behind him starved. The walls before him cracked, and still he held, until at last the gates gave way, and what followed was slaughter. Not battle, not war. Slaughter. When the dust settled, they looked for someone to blame. They found him in London, Gladstone, indecisive, cautious, too slow to act. While Gordon died at his post, Gladstone hedged bets from behind a desk. And when the burden of empire grew too heavy, he turned away. He deemed a skirmish in Afghanistan more urgent, and he let Sudan burn. The Mahdi didn't live to enjoy his triumph for long. Disease took him, as it takes kings and prophets alike. His torch passed to the Caliph, and the fire burned on. The British did not return, at least not immediately. They waited, they brooded. But when they came back in 1897, they came with fury. Kitchener led the charge, not as a man seeking justice, but as an executioner delivering a sentence. The Nile ran blood red. Kitchener emerged a titan, lord of Khartoum, vanquisher of empires. He broke the Boers, then he rose again, this time to command the empire's armies in the bloodbath of the First World War. But let this be carved into the bones of history. There was a time, fleeting, defiant, when desert warriors, barefoot and blood-soaked, struck fear into the heart of an empire. The dervishes, the Hadendoa, the men called Fuzzy Wuzzy. They stood alongside the Afghans and the Zulus in that narrow, sacred line of those who dared to challenge the greatest superpower the world had ever seen. And they made it bleed. This was not just war. This was the moment when global empire cracked. Thanks for listening. Let's now descend into the killing fields of the comment section. Like yesterday, I'm going to read a reply on the Siege of the Alamo. Our listener, GPK Song, wrote, "You forgot to mention slavery in Texas and the Texas Republic and the state of Texas. Any slave state has no legitimacy, no moral high ground, no claim to be protecting liberty or rights or freedom. Texas is still a backward state of racism, inequality, and fascism. There are no heroes in your tale, just violent and greedy white guys." And this was my response to GPK Song, and I'll read it. This response will be a couple of paragraphs, and I'll probably highlight it in my next episode, but here's my take on this subject. GPK Song, you raise a vital and difficult point, one that any honest historian must wrestle with when telling stories of the past. The presence and defense of slavery in the Republic of Texas, and later in the state itself, is an undeniable stain that cannot be dismissed. It shaped policies, drove political alliances, and compromised any pure claim to liberty that Texian leaders might have made. Texian then, and we say Texan now. Slavery is a moral abyss. There is no justification for it today, and any history of Texas that omits it is incomplete at best and dishonest at worst. But to judge the past solely through the lens of today's values is to risk a certain kind of historical blindness. We do not excuse men for their sins by placing them in context, but we do understand them better. That understanding is not exoneration, it is clarity. The men who fought at the Alamo did so for a variety of reasons, some for land, some for self-governance, some with motivations steeped in supremacy and economic ambition. Others believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were fighting tyranny. History is rarely made by heroes or villains alone. It is shaped by people like you and me, flawed, driven, sometimes noble, often contradictory. The Texas Revolution included men who upheld freedom and men who denied it to others. That is the bitter paradox of a revolution fought under the banner of liberty by men who also claimed the right to own other human beings, which is a tale that bleeds into all cultures, all lands, and for all of time until recently. As for Texas today, like every state, it holds contradictions. It has dark legacies, as do all states. It also contains communities, movements, and individuals working tirelessly for justice, equality, and truth. To write off the whole as irredeemable is to surrender the field to the worst elements of its history, similar to judging you based on your worst qualities. The danger in flattening history to a single moral judgment is that we stop learning from it. We give away wisdom for outrage, and once we do that, we are no longer seeking truth. We're just choosing sides, choosing narratives that suit our individual visions of ourselves. So yes, slavery must be named. So must the full, uncomfortable truth. But history asks us to do more than condemn. It asks that we understand. And through that understanding, we gain the one thing the past can still offer us: perspective. Thanks for listening. See you guys tomorrow.